The Moral Logic of Survivor Guilt by Nancy Sherman. We have learned from returning war veterans, especially those of the last decade, that the emotional reality of soldiers at home is often at odds with that of the people they left behind. Friends and families of returning service members may be grateful or feel relief this holiday. Meanwhile, many of those they've welcomed home are likely struggling with other emotions. Is the sense of responsibility soldiers feel toward each other unreasonable? High on that list of emotions is guilt. Soldiers often carry this burden home. Survivor guilt is perhaps the most well-known kind. In war, standing here rather than there can save your life but cost a buddy his. It's random luck, but you feel responsible. The guilt begins an endless loop of what-ifs or if-onlys. These thoughts tell you could have or should have done otherwise. In fact, you did nothing wrong. These feelings are, of course, not found only on the battlefield, but given the great amount of loss in war, they hang heavy there and follow soldiers everywhere, and they raise the question of just how unreasonable those feelings are, and if they aren't, of what basis there is for their being reasonable. Captain Adrian Bonenberger, head of a unit in Afghanistan, pondered these questions recently as he thought about Specialist Jeremiah Pulaski. Pulaski was killed by police following a deadly bar fight shortly after he returned home. Back in Afghanistan, Pulaski had saved Bonenberger's life twice in one day. When Pulaski needed help, Bonenberger couldn't be there for him. When he was in trouble, he was alone, Captain Bonenberger said. When we were in trouble, he was there for us. I know it's not rational or reasonable. There's nothing logical about it, but I feel responsible. But how unreasonable is that feeling? Subjective guilt is the term associated with this sense of responsibility. Subjective guilt is thought to be unreasonable because one feels guilty despite the fact that he knows he has done nothing wrong. By contrast, objective or rational guilt describes guilt that matches one's actions. Objective guilt is the result of real wrongdoing. Guilt is appropriate because one acted to intentionally harm someone, or because one could have prevented harm and did not. A person is to blame here when he could have done something other than what he did, and so he is held responsible or accountable by himself or others. But as Bonenberger's remarks make clear, we often take responsibility in a way that goes far beyond what we can reasonably be held responsible for, and we feel the guilt that comes with that sense of responsibility. Nietzsche is the modern philosopher who well understood this phenomenon. Das schlechte Gewissen, German for bad conscience, was his term for the consciousness of guilt, where one has done nothing wrong. Bad conscience doesn't occur where we would most expect it, he argued. For example, we don't always find it in prisons where there are actually guilty individuals who should feel bad about doing wrong. In the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche appeals to an earlier philosopher, Spinoza, for support. The bite of conscience, writes Spinoza, is the ethics that has to do with an offense where something has gone unexpectedly wrong. As Nietzsche adds, it is not really a case of, I ought not to have done that. But what then is it a case of? Part of the reasonableness of survivor guilt, and in a sense its fittingness, is that it depends on a moral significance that is broader than moral action. Who I am, in terms of my character and relationships, and not just what I do, decides whether I am a good person. Of course, character is expressed in action. Certainly when we don't walk the walk, we are lacking. However, character is also expressed in emotions and attitudes. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, insists on this point. Virtue is concerned with emotions and actions, he declares. Good character is found at the middle point of both. Moreover, many of the feelings that express character are not about what one has done or should have done. Rather, they are about what one cares deeply about. Aristotle doesn't talk specifically about guilt. However, it is the emotion that best expresses the conflict between the desire or obligation to help and the inability, through no fault of one's own, to do so. To not feel the guilt is to be numb to that conflict. It is that conflict that Bonenberger feels when he says he wasn't there for Pulaski when he needed him. The sacred bond among soldiers originates not just in duty, but in love. In many of the interviews I've conducted with soldiers over the years, feelings of guilt and responsibility tangle with feelings of having betrayed fellow soldiers. At stake is the duty to those soldiers, the duty to hold intact the bond that enables them to fight for and with each other. The soldiers share the kind of sacred bond that the ancients memorialized. They embody the Marine motto, Semper Fidelis, but it is not just duty at work, it is love. Service members, especially those higher in rank, routinely talk about unit members as my soldiers, my Marines, my sailors. They are family members, their own children of sorts, whose safety is their responsibility. To fall short of unconditional care is experienced as a failure to be faithful. Survivor guilt piles on the unconscious thought that luck is a part of the game of give and take. To have good luck is to take it away from someone else. The intense pain of guilt is a way of sharing some of the bad luck. It is a form of compassionate suffering. Many philosophers have looked to other terms to define the feeling. What they have come up with is agent regret. British philosopher Bernard Williams coined the term, but many others have used it. The classic scenario is not so much one of good luck as in survivor guilt, but of bad luck. Typically, agent regret has to do with accidents, where again there is little or no blame for the harms caused. In these cases, people may have technically caused the harm through their actions, but they are not morally responsible for what happened. But in my opinion, the idea of agent regret does not account for how subjective guilt feels. Despite its use of the word agent, which suggests someone who acts intentionally, it sounds as passive and flat as the phrase regretting that the weather is bad, or more tellingly, as empty of human compassion as the message sent to military families. The Secretary of Defense regrets to inform you that. Indeed, the soldiers I've talked to involved in accidents that took their fellow soldiers' lives didn't feel regret for what happened. They felt raw, deep guilt. And the guilt remained long after the military ruled that they were not responsible for their fellow soldiers' deaths. In one horrible case in April 2003 in Iraq, the gun on a Bradley fighting vehicle misfired. The blast blew off most of the face of Private Joseph Mayak, who was standing guard near the vehicle. The accident was caused by a broken replacement battery that the commander in charge had approved. When the vehicle's ignition was turned on, the replacement battery in the turret, a Marine battery rather than an Army one, failed to shut off electric power to the gun. Mayak, who was 20, died. The Army officer in charge, then Captain John Pryor, recalled the terrifying scene for me. He told me of the failed attempts in the medic tent to save Mayak's life. He then turned to his feelings of responsibility. I'm the one who placed the vehicles. I'm the one who set the security. As with most accidents, I'm not in jail right now. Clearly, I wasn't extremely responsible, but it was a series of errors. Any one of a dozen decisions made over the course of a 2-month period, and none of them really occurs to you at the time. Any one of those made differently may have saved his life. So I dealt with and still deal with the guilt of having cost him his life, essentially. There's probably not a day that goes by that I don't think about it, at least for a moment. What Pryor feels is guilt. It is not simply regret that things didn't work out differently. He feels the awful weight of self-blame. He feels the pain of the victim and of the survivors. He feels the need to make moral repair. If he didn't feel that, we would probably think less of him as a commander. In his case, moral repair came through an emotional, painful connection with Mayak's mother. After the accident, Pryor and his first sergeant wrote a letter to Mayak's mother, and for some time after, she replied with care packages to the soldiers and with letters. "Oh, it was terrible," said Pryor. "The letters weren't just very matter of fact, here's what we did today. It was more like a mother writing to her son." Pryor had become the son who was no longer. "It was her way of dealing with grief," said Pryor, "and so I had a responsibility to try to give back." In all this, we might say guilt, subjective guilt, has a saving side. It is a way that soldiers impose moral order on the chaos and awful randomness of war's violence. It is a way they personalize the effects of war for themselves, for their buddies, and for us as civilians, too. But if that's all that is involved, it sounds too moralistic. It makes guilt appropriate because it's good for society. It is the way we all can deal with war. Maybe instead we want to say it is fitting because it is evolutionarily adaptive in the way that fear is. But again, that doesn't do justice to the experience of guilt. The guilt that soldiers feel isn't just morally practical or evolutionarily useful. It is fitting because it gets right certain morals and values of a soldier's world. Good soldiers depend on each other. They come to love each other. They have duties to care and bring each other safely home. Philosophers, at least since the time of Kant, have called these imperfect duties. Even in the best circumstances, we can't perfectly act with them in mind. Duties to others need to make room for duties to self, even in a soldier's life of service and sacrifice. Even soldiers need to practice self-forgiveness and self-sympathy. These are part of full moral repair.